announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
At dawn, the Caribbean looked calm enough to deceive satellites. The sea was flat, the horizon clear, and the world's busiest shipping lanes moved as they always do, quietly, efficiently, unnoticed. But beneath that stillness, something was shifting. Radar screens were no longer routine. Radio channels were no longer casual. And somewhere beyond the curve of the Earth, two naval forces were watching each other a little too closely. What began as a routine maneuver by a U.S. carrier strike group quickly turned into something far more dangerous. Officially, it was an exercise. Unofficially, it was a message. The USS Gerald R. Ford and her escorts had entered the region days earlier, projecting presence, conducting flight operations, and reminding the hemisphere who controlled the sea lanes. Then, Venezuelan patrol craft began appearing at the edge of radar range. First one, then several, then more. No press releases warned of what was coming. No public statements hinted at confrontation. Yet within hours, encrypted communications between ships intensified. Fighter jets were cycled into the air more frequently. Targeting systems were powered up, not locked, but ready. And Venezuelan naval units, long underestimated by analysts, began moving in coordinated patterns that did not look accidental. The first warnings were issued over open channels, professional, controlled, by the book. Distance was maintained, until it wasn't. Small, fast-moving vessels cut across established maritime boundaries. Larger ships adjusted course in ways that made collision a real possibility. Each maneuver could be explained away as defensive. Each move could also be read as deliberate escalation. Then came the moment that changed everything. A radar spike, a heat signature, a split-second decision in a combat information center illuminated only by screens. What happened next would be debated for years. Who fired first? Was it a warning shot, a defensive measure, or a miscalculation amplified by tension? Within seconds, the Caribbean sky was no longer empty. It was alive with interceptors, countermeasures, and the unmistakable roar of combat aircraft launching from a nuclear-powered carrier. What few outside classified briefings understand is how quickly modern naval warfare unfolds. Not minutes, seconds. Automated defense systems track threats faster than human reaction time. Pilots make decisions at supersonic speed. Electronic warfare units flood the spectrum with signals designed to blind and confuse. In that compressed timeline, hesitation can mean catastrophe. For a brief window, the possibility of a regional incident turned into the risk of a hemispheric crisis. Shipping companies halted routes. Intelligence agencies worldwide shifted assets toward the Caribbean. Energy markets trembled at rumors of disruption. And in Washington and Caracas, leaders faced the same question: escalate or step back? By the time the smoke cleared, literally and politically, the balance of power in the region had been tested in a way not seen in decades. Damage assessments began. Diplomatic channels reopened. Official narratives hardened. But one truth remained unavoidable. The illusion of stability in the Caribbean had been shattered. Tonight, we reconstruct the hours that brought two nations to the brink at sea. The maneuvers, the miscalculations, the technology, and the decisions that almost changed the course of the region. This is the story of the clash that nearly ignited the Caribbean, and the thin line that kept it from becoming something far worse. In the early hours of that morning, the Caribbean Sea carried the heavy stillness that so often precedes a storm, even when the sky itself is clear. The U.S. carrier strike group built around the USS Gerald R. Ford was operating in international waters north of Venezuela, officially conducting a scheduled maritime security exercise focused on air defense integration and freedom of navigation. The Ford, the newest and most technologically advanced aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, displaced more than 100,000 tons and carried an air wing capable of launching dozens of sorties per day. Around her sailed the familiar shield of a modern strike group, guided missile destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system, at least one Ticonderoga-class cruiser providing additional air and missile defense coordination, and a fast attack submarine operating silently beyond visual range. E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft rotated overhead, their radar sweeping hundreds of miles in every direction, while F/A-18 Super Hornets cycled through patrol patterns designed to project presence without appearing overtly aggressive. For Washington, the deployment was consistent with long-standing policy. The Caribbean remains strategically important due to major shipping lanes, energy infrastructure, and proximity to the U.S. mainland. In recent years, tensions with Caracas had fluctuated between diplomatic standoffs and economic sanctions, and U.S. naval activity in the region was often framed as counter-narcotics support or multinational cooperation with regional partners. Yet the scale of this particular formation did not go unnoticed. Satellite imagery circulated among defense analysts showed the Ford Strike Group maintaining tighter formation spacing than usual for a routine exercise, a subtle but deliberate posture that suggested heightened readiness. On the Venezuelan side, the Bolivarian Navy had been monitoring the strike group since it entered the broader Caribbean basin days earlier. Venezuela's fleet, while significantly smaller and less technologically advanced than that of the United States, includes offshore patrol vessels, missile-equipped fast attack craft, and coastal defense systems designed primarily for deterrence. The Guayquerí-class patrol ships, built with Spanish assistance, and the smaller Vosper-type missile boats form the backbone of its surface combat capability. Coastal radar stations along the northern shoreline fed tracking data to naval headquarters near La Guaira, and maritime patrol aircraft conducted limited overflights to visually confirm the U.S. formation's movements. According to later briefings, Venezuelan command grew concerned when the strike group adjusted course slightly southward during nighttime flight operations, bringing it closer to what Caracas considers a sensitive defensive perimeter. Officially, the carrier remained in international waters. Unofficially, the shift was interpreted as pressure. In response, several Venezuelan patrol vessels were ordered to sea before sunrise. What began as a shadowing operation quickly evolved into a more coordinated display. Fast coastal intercept craft departed from Puerto Cabello, while a larger patrol vessel took up a parallel course several nautical miles off the carrier group's starboard flank. By mid-morning, radar screens aboard the U.S. destroyers showed a noticeable uptick in surface contacts approaching from the southwest. None crossed into an exclusion zone, but their vectors were unmistakably converging. The U.S. Navy maintained standard protocols. Bridge-to-bridge radio contact was established, positions were exchanged, and warnings about safe distance were issued in calm, professional tones. Yet observers later noted that at least 2 Venezuelan vessels executed high-speed lateral passes at ranges closer than typically recommended under the code for unplanned encounters at sea. Whether this was a calculated signal or overzealous seamanship remains disputed. Adding to the tension were reports, never officially confirmed, that Venezuelan coastal defense units briefly activated fire control radars associated with shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. U.S. electronic surveillance aircraft detected emissions consistent with targeting systems, though no missiles were launched and no locks were sustained. From the American perspective, it was a probing gesture. From the Venezuelan perspective, it may have been a defensive drill conducted simultaneously with the naval deployment. In the compressed logic of military signaling, intent is often inferred rather than declared. As the sun climbed higher, the sea between the two forces narrowed not in distance, but in perception. Aircraft continued to launch and recover from the Ford's deck, their afterburners flashing against the blue horizon. Venezuelan vessels maintained visual contact, occasionally adjusting speed to mirror the carrier group's maneuvers. Both sides operated within legal frameworks of international maritime law, yet each movement carried political weight. The day had begun as a demonstration of presence. By midday, it had become a test of resolve, with every radar sweep, engine throttle, and radio transmission contributing to a fragile equilibrium that could shift in seconds. By early afternoon, the geometry of the sea had tightened into something unmistakably deliberate. The U.S. carrier strike group maintained its steady course, but the spacing between ships subtly shifted as tactical commanders adjusted to the growing cluster of Venezuelan contacts on their scopes. Inside the Combat Information Center of one of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, radar operators tracked fast-moving surface returns, weaving across commercial shipping lanes, their speeds fluctuating between 25 and 40 knots. The contacts were identified as Venezuelan fast attack craft and coastal patrol vessels, operating well within their rights in international waters, yet closing distances in ways that naval officers recognize as calculated pressure. Bridge-to-bridge radio calls began formally. The American destroyer issued a standard maritime safety advisory, calmly stating its position, course, and speed, and requesting that approaching vessels maintain a safe separation. The Venezuelan response came seconds later, equally composed, asserting sovereign security interests and requesting clarification of the carrier group's flight operations. The exchange remained professional, but the tone carried an unmistakable edge. Each side repeated its message, as if recording history in real time. Overhead, an E-2D Hawkeye continued to orbit, its powerful radar painting a comprehensive air and surface picture for the strike group. FA-18 Super Hornets maintained a combat air patrol farther out, visible only as fleeting streaks against the high clouds. On the Venezuelan side, coastal radar stations reportedly increased transmission power, and at least one maritime patrol aircraft conducted a low-altitude pass several miles from the carrier formation. Though no aircraft crossed directly overhead, the message was clear. The Americans were being watched from sea and air. The first real spike in tension came not from a weapon, but from maneuvering. Two Venezuelan fast craft accelerated abruptly, crossing ahead of a U.S. destroyer at a distance that forced the American captain to order a minor course correction to maintain safe passage. International regulations require vessels to avoid creating risk of collision, and while no collision occurred, the optics were provocative. The destroyer's crew moved to heightened alert, additional lookouts posted, fire control systems powered but not locked. Sailors could see the silhouettes of the Venezuelan boats through binoculars, their hull numbers visible. Crews stationed at deck-mounted weapons that remained pointed skyward, but ready. Electronic warfare officers aboard the cruiser detected intermittent radar emissions, consistent with surface search systems transitioning into more focused tracking modes. The signals were brief, almost teasing, but enough to prompt a shift from routine monitoring to defensive posture. In response, U.S. ships adjusted their own sensor arrays, ensuring that Aegis systems were fully synchronized. No missile hatches opened, no targeting radars locked, yet every operator in the chain understood how quickly such a posture could change. Then came the moment that compressed hours into seconds. A Venezuelan patrol vessel transmitted a sharp radio warning, alleging that one of the carrier's aircraft had entered what it described as a restricted defensive zone. The U.S. side denied the claim, citing international airspace and flight data. As the exchange unfolded, one of the fast craft altered course again, this time angling directly toward the outer screen of the strike group at high speed. From the American perspective, the trajectory resembled the opening phase of a swarm tactic often studied in naval exercises. From the Venezuelan perspective, it may have been an aggressive but symbolic assertion of presence. On board the destroyer, the tactical action officer requested permission to deploy warning measures. Within moments, a bright flare arced into the sky from the American ship, a universally recognized signal intended to deter further approach without escalating to lethal force. The Venezuelan craft veered slightly but did not immediately withdraw. For several breathless seconds, both vessels held their courses in near parallel, separated by a stretch of water that felt thinner than it was. Across the formation, sailors gripped railings and scanned horizons. Orders were spoken in clipped tones. Fire control radars remained in standby, but fingers hovered close to escalation thresholds defined in rules of engagement that had been reviewed countless times in classrooms, yet rarely tested in such proximity. The sea itself seemed indifferent, rolling gently beneath hulls that now represented far more than steel and machinery. In those first seconds of overt confrontation, neither side had fired a shot. Yet the space between caution and conflict had narrowed to the width of a single misinterpreted signal. The first unmistakable transition from brinkmanship to combat came not with a broadside, but with a launch signature. A sharp spike flared across multiple American sensor feeds almost simultaneously. Infrared bloom, radar acceleration, trajectory climbing just above sea level. Within seconds, the algorithms embedded in the Aegis combat system classified the object as a likely anti-ship cruise missile. Later assessments would suggest it was launched from a coastal battery rather than a surface vessel. But in that moment, origin mattered less than velocity. Sea skimming profiles are designed to exploit the curvature of the Earth and reduce reaction time. At high subsonic speed, defenders have less than a minute to respond. The U.S. cruiser serving as air defense commander reacted automatically. Standard missile interceptors were authorized and fired in rapid sequence, their vertical launch system cells erupting in controlled bursts of flame. The intercept geometry unfolded beyond visual range for most sailors, visible primarily as tracks converging on tactical displays. The first interceptor missed by meters. The second detonated close enough to shred the incoming missile's airframe. Debris scattered into the sea several miles from the formation. Even as confirmation filtered in, a second launch was detected, this time accompanied by electronic noise intended to complicate tracking. The defense grid adapted, shifting frequencies, filtering interference, and engaging again. Two more interceptors streaked upward, and the second threat was neutralized farther out. Almost immediately, the Venezuelan surface units altered behavior. Fast craft that had been maneuvering assertively now accelerated in coordinated arcs, spreading out in what resembled a textbook swarm tactic. Small boats armed with heavy machine guns and possibly short-range rockets are not individually decisive against a carrier group, but en masse they can overwhelm attention and compress engagement timelines. From the carrier's deck, flight operations shifted from routine cycles to combat configuration. F/A-18 Super Hornets already airborne were retasked, their pilots receiving updated coordinates and clearance to employ precision-guided munitions if hostile intent was confirmed. The first kinetic exchange at sea occurred when one of the approaching fast craft fired what analysts later identified as unguided rockets in the general direction of a U.S. destroyer. The rockets fell short, splashing harmlessly, but the act crossed an unmistakable threshold. The destroyer responded with controlled bursts from its Mark 45 5-inch gun, calibrated to disable rather than obliterate. One Venezuelan craft was struck near the stern, smoke rising as it slowed and drifted. Other boats scattered, some continuing their advance, others breaking away toward the coast. Electronic warfare intensified in parallel. American ships deployed decoys and activated jamming systems designed to confuse radar-guided threats. Communications experienced intermittent disruption as both sides flooded portions of the spectrum. For several tense minutes, situational awareness narrowed as operators fought to maintain a coherent picture. The carrier's escorts tightened their formation slightly, optimizing overlapping fields of fire. A second wave of missile signatures appeared on sensors, fewer than the first but closer in origin. Whether fired in desperation or as part of a pre-planned sequence, they forced another rapid intercept cycle. Close-in weapon systems, the automated Gatling guns mounted on several ships, shifted from standby to active tracking, ready to engage if outer layer defenses failed. In the air, American fighters executed low-altitude runs against identified launch sites along the coastline. Using a combination of radar-guided and laser-guided munitions, they targeted radar emitters and suspected missile transport vehicles rather than broad infrastructure. Explosions along the shore marked successful strikes, and subsequent sensor sweeps indicated a sharp decline in hostile emissions. One Super Hornet reported minor damage from ground fire but returned safely to the carrier. The turning point came when U.S. commanders made a decision that balanced force with restraint. Rather than pursue fleeing vessels toward Venezuelan territorial waters, a move that could have escalated the conflict dramatically, they established a defensive perimeter and focused on neutralizing only active threats. A submarine positioned beyond the visible battle space reportedly tracked a larger Venezuelan patrol ship that had been coordinating movements, but no torpedoes were launched. Instead, a final airstrike disabled its propulsion without sinking it, leaving the vessel adrift but afloat. As smoke drifted across patches of the sea, the tempo of combat slowed. Surviving fast craft retreated toward the coastline. Radar screens that had been crowded with hostile tracks began to clear. Damage control teams aboard the U.S. destroyer assessed minor superficial impacts from shrapnel, but no catastrophic breaches. On the Venezuelan side, at least 2 vessels were confirmed disabled, and coastal missile capability appeared significantly degraded. Casualty figures were unclear in the immediate aftermath, though emergency signals from Venezuelan ships suggested injuries aboard the damaged craft. In command centers far from the water, the political dimension was unfolding as rapidly as the tactical one. Diplomatic channels, dormant during the exchange, reactivated with urgency. Both governments issued preliminary statements framing the engagement as defensive. International observers called for de-escalation. Energy markets reacted within hours, reflecting fears that further instability in the Caribbean could threaten shipping routes. At sea, however, the decisive phase had passed. The carrier strike group maintained station, aircraft continuing overwatch in case of renewed aggression. Venezuelan naval units consolidated closer to shore, focusing on search and rescue operations for disabled vessels. The immediate clash had lasted less than an hour from first launch to final strike. Yet within that compressed window, modern naval warfare had demonstrated its unforgiving speed. Layers of missile defense, coordinated air power, electronic countermeasures, and disciplined command decisions prevented the confrontation from spiraling into a broader regional war. The sea, which had seemed poised to ignite, gradually returned to a tense but quieter state, marked by drifting smoke, scattered debris, and the sobering realization on both sides of how narrow the margin between deterrence and disaster had truly been. As the final radar contacts faded and no new launch signatures appeared, the confrontation transitioned from combat to containment. The U.S. carrier strike group did not advance or withdraw. Instead, it stabilized its position in international waters, maintaining a defensive posture, while aircraft continued combat air patrols at extended range. The absence of further hostile emissions from the coastline suggested that the most immediate threat had been suppressed, but no commander assumed the crisis was over. Warships operate on confirmation, not assumption. Sensor sweeps were repeated, satellite feeds cross-checked, and airborne surveillance expanded its orbit to ensure that no additional missile batteries or fast attack formations were mobilizing beyond the visible horizon. On the Venezuelan side, surviving naval units regrouped closer to territorial waters. Distress beacons from disabled vessels triggered maritime rescue protocols, and civilian harbor tugs reportedly moved out under naval escort to assist damaged craft. Venezuelan state media broadcast statements describing the clash as a defensive action against provocative maneuvers, while footage, carefully edited, showed smoke rising near the coastline. Official casualty numbers were not immediately released, but unofficial maritime radio chatter indicated injuries among several crews and at least one confirmed fatality aboard a fast attack vessel struck during the exchange. Aboard the American ships, the atmosphere shifted from kinetic urgency to controlled assessment. Damage control teams completed full hull inspections, confirming that no critical systems had been compromised. One destroyer reported minor superficial scoring along its outer hull from fragmented debris, but propulsion, radar arrays, and weapons systems remained fully operational. The carrier's flight deck crews worked methodically to reset aircraft for sustained readiness rather than immediate strike operations. Medical personnel treated a handful of minor injuries, mostly stress-related or the result of rapid maneuvering during general quarters, but there were no confirmed combat fatalities on the U.S. side. The most significant immediate consequence was strategic rather than physical. Within hours, commercial shipping advisories were issued by international maritime organizations, warning vessels to exercise caution in the affected sector of the Caribbean. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting nearby routes spiked temporarily amid uncertainty about further escalation. Several regional governments called for emergency consultations through the Organization of American States, urging restraint and independent investigation into the initial missile launches. Behind closed doors, diplomatic channels between Washington and Caracas reopened under significant pressure from neighboring states concerned about regional stability. Intelligence assessments conducted in the first 12 hours suggested that the Venezuelan coastal missile capability in the engagement area had been significantly degraded, though not entirely eliminated. Analysts cautioned that any perception of decisive victory could fuel domestic political narratives on both sides, potentially hardening positions rather than easing tensions. Meanwhile, the U.S. strike group remained on station longer than originally scheduled, a visible signal that freedom of navigation would be maintained despite the clash. By nightfall, the sea that had carried missiles and tracer fire only hours earlier appeared deceptively calm once again. Navigation lights blinked steadily across the horizon. Commercial traffic resumed cautious movement along adjusted corridors. Yet the psychological impact lingered. Naval planners in multiple capitals began reviewing engagement protocols, electronic warfare performance, and escalation thresholds. The encounter had demonstrated how rapidly a localized confrontation could ignite under modern conditions, where seconds determine outcomes and interpretation shapes consequences. In the end, neither side claimed retreat in the conventional sense, but both stepped back from the brink. The immediate violence subsided, replaced by a fragile deterrence reinforced by heightened alert. The Caribbean returned to its outward routine, yet beneath that surface lay a recalibrated balance, one defined not by absence of conflict, but by the shared understanding of how close the region had come to something far more destructive.